Welcome to all you patchworkers. My goodness, it seems like it's been an eternity since we have been with you. But trust me when I tell you, myself and the cameraman have been quite busy over the last few months, but we're so excited to be back with you, and we're double excited about all of the new people who have joined our Patchwork Staycation page. But we are going to start at what I believe is the beginning. We're going to be working on simplistic elements like squares and rectangles because that's really the basics of most patchwork blocks. So if you can't sew a good square to another square, you're going to really run into trouble when you're sewing triangles. So let's get to it. Okay, the first thing I want to show you is how I clean up my very first cut when I'm working on a piece of fabric, whether it be a half a yard, a fat quarter, or whatever it is. And many people, I think, struggle with this, and this is where you get those boomerangs when you cut a strip and you've got those weird little angles. This is one way that I do try to avoid that. Not to say it never happens, but it rarely happens. When I lay the ruler down, and again, the choice of your ruler is going to be strictly up to you, but I want a ruler that I can position. In this case, this is a 4x14. I don't care what you work with, but you can see that as I move this, see how there's a messy cut? So these are really impossible to work with. Here's what most everybody I watch cut does. I better clean up that first cut. So they take a ruler and they try to get in there and they try to cut that little wonky piece. I think that's difficult. What I recommend you do is to try to slide over. Now I'm going to cut a 2-inch strip because it'll be easier for you to see that 2-inch line. So here's my 2-inch line. My first cut, my goal is to have the selvage and the fold kind of marry each other right there. So I see how clean that is, and that tells me that I'm organized in my direction as opposed to this. See, if the fabric's offline there, then you're for sure going to get a boomerang when you make this cut. So I'm going to get prepared. I'm going to lay my ruler down. I love to have one of the lines on the ruler be on the fold, and I typically cut a double. I double fold it so I don't need that big, long, complicated ruler. It's a lot to work with. I like a shorter ruler. So I'm going to go and I'm going to slide over until the 2-inch line has cleared this smallest cut. I'm going to place my hand. Now I'm sitting down to cut, and I don't recommend that, but I'm sitting because of the demo. I'm going to slide into the 2, place my hand, open my cutter, and I'm going to make this first cut like that. Now the next thing I do is I'm going to turn this piece I just cut over, put my ruler back down, and now you'll be able to see how easy it goes to that 2-inch mark right there. Now this looks like a lot of waste, and it probably is a little more than I needed to do, but take a look at that. Do you see how I got rid of all of that junk without having to do that first cut, which is very difficult to do without getting it to move a little bit? Now, if I was ready to go, all I got to do is I have a clean cut and I won't get those boomerangs. Then I'm just ready to march across there. Now, once I have cut my strip, and depending on the pattern I'm working on, I'm going to cut X number of squares this size or X number of rectangles. But what I want you to bear in mind is try not to focus on what size I'm cutting, but the way I'm cutting. So I first get my selvage off. Because I cut my strip 2 inches, ideally to cut 2-inch squares, folks, try to work with a square ruler, because when you pick up a rectangle ruler, yes, I can get a box here, but if that was a 2 1/4, it starts to look like that. So if you get yourself familiar with the brand you like in a rectangle, I would find a mating to that in a square. And I don't care what size square, but see how easy it is for me to cut a 2-inch square right there. And then when I come down here, these little guys, and I'm just going to cut a few just to show you that. Let's take a look at this. This is a 1 1/4. Now I would still clean that up. I would still put See how nice that box sits right in the pink lines or the 1/4 inch lines on this brand? See how nice that sits in there? That's it on the cutting. So I've cut a square. Now let's say I needed to do a rectangle. Let's say I want a 1 1/4 by a 3. I would just slide right there and I cut whatever it is that I want. I get between my strip cutter and my square cutter, everything that we're going to do in this segment can be done that way. Let's take a look at how we're going to sew some of these and some of my favorite things to use while you're sewing. In one of the posts, I told you a few of the most important things to have when you start this program, aside from the brand of your machine. That's personal. I referred to a straight stitch throat plate, and that is the throat plate that when the needle goes down, it's a tiny little circle instead of this wide opening. If you only have this on your sewing machine, you're going to struggle with getting an accurate 1/4 inch because the needle will force that seam down in that hole and adjust it. So this is number 1 for me in patchwork. Number 2 is an accurate 1/4 inch foot. And if you look at this, the toe on this foot for this brand, and now you can see that it's aligned perfectly so that if I stay in that position, I have a great 1/4 inch. Then you notice what I'm working with. My stiletto, I mentioned it's an alternate product I think is handy. There's jillions of them out there. I think we even have one that we'll put down in the link below that is really one of my favorites. Another thing that I mentioned about was having a good thread. What you're looking at here is Aurifil, which is my favorite, and there's good threads in the industry, but this is, in my opinion, a great thread. The orange cone will tell you that this is a 50 weight thread, and that's what I typically use to piece with. If you're piecing with a poly or something like that, I would encourage you to fall in love with a good 100% cotton thread. The green colored cone is a 40 weight thread, which quite frankly is very competitive to most 50 weight brands, but this is my go-to. Small spool, large spool, and I tell you on a standard bobbin you can wind about 16 to 18 bobbins with this spool of thread. So economically it's a good price. So if you got those things lined up, you're ready to go. Now everything we're doing in this session is going to relate to, frankly, just sewing squares or rectangles together. In this case, I'm going to be looking at sewing a 4-patch together. So the only thing you're going to do first when you're sewing 4 patches is to decide if they're going to be random or are they the same. I kind of picked 4 squares where these are the darks and these are the lights, and so let's say I needed 50 of those. I would just simply do everything in pairs. So I would just lay down that guy right there and that one. Now, it wouldn't make any difference which way I sew these. They can all be sewn this way with the light on top because I can reverse them once I get them sewn. So when you're doing 4 patches, decide if they're going to be random and then just run 2s through your sewing machine. So let's run a couple through the machine. Okay, now we're sewing a little awkward because we've got to make sure you see this on camera. So obviously I'd be sitting straight on my needle when I was sewing for real. So as I go to the machine, now some of you are out there going, why she got that thing stuck in that sewing machine? I love to have a tail in here just because it assures me that that first stitch is going straight into what I'm after. My machine's okay sewing the other way, but this is personal. The other thing, when you're sewing all these 4 patches and 9 patches, I would advise you to have a bunch of those ready, whatever you're working on, and then instead of this, make it a pair of units so that you're prepping for making your 4 patch. That tells me I'm a little lazy. I'm also going to be using my stiletto just to show you how important it is when you start sewing. So I've aligned with my toe. This is critical that every machine is a tad different in the way they read, but a 1/4 inch is a 1/4 inch, and that's a fact. So let's sew this little 2-patch. I would then pick up the next one. Now bear in mind, on some quilts, you might need hundreds of these. So you would see why it would be important to maybe, instead of that little cheater thing, that you throw in another little 2-patch. And at this point, once I've sewn all of those, then I make the decision of how I'm going to organize it. So that's our 4-patch. Okay, what we're looking at now is the 9-patch setup. And one of the things that, especially some of you new sewers may not be familiar with the term a positive and a negative 9-patch. And as you look at this, you'll see that I have 5 dark here, but I only have 4 dark here. In patchwork language, this is almost always referred to as a positive 9-patch. This would be referred to as a negative 9-patch. So when you're building some of these patterns we're using today, it's important that you understand you sew them exactly the same as far as joining the pair, the pair, the pair, add the third, add the third, add the third. I sew them the same, but it's seam direction that's so crucial. And whether this is black or white, when there's 5 of them of one color, I'm going to let that be my lead. So in this case, I would take the light to the dark, the light to the dark, light to the dark. Here, I'd take the light to the dark, the same thing. But what's so great about this, as we build some of our patterns, when I sew that way, then this unit will sit next to this unit with the seams always in the right position. So as far as sewing this, I don't sew it a bit different than I just sewed the 2-patch. I just join pair, 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 bing, 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 and then we're all set. Now you see these units sewn, and we didn't feel like you guys needed to watch the sewing machine work to do this because we did some little step outs for you. So here's what the 9-patch looks like sewn. That is really the only technique you need, so you can see why a very, very, very new beginner can have success with this. You saw when we sewed the 4-patch, you saw how I actually just sewed a bunch of 2-patches together. So I just ran through and made a batch of 2-patches. So let's say you have a stack of these guys right here. And you go, what could I do with these silly little 4-patches? Well, take a look at this cute little checkerboard. Now, for those experienced award-winning sewers out there, you're all going, good grief, she's going to show me how to make a checkerboard. I'm telling you, folks, for learning to manipulate your seams, first of all, if you have your quilting done by a long-arm quilter, they're going to love you for this because it says you know how to control the seams on the back of a quilt. And that's not an easy thing to do. If you learn to do it on a 4-patch and a 9-patch, then you can do it when you come into triangles and more complicated elements. So I think it's important to go back and address the basics of patchwork, which will help you in everything you do, regardless of how complicated the quilt is. So as you look at these pictures of these little checkerboards, my goodness, I can make them any size in the world. And one of the things I want you to keep in mind, for every project sheet that we're going to share with you, I might tell you to cut a 2.5, but you all know it doesn't matter. You just decide to cut a 3.5 or a 2 3/4 or a 4. We've told you what to cut to get the look of what we've got, but I don't want you married to that. I want you to be able to be independent and make what you want. All a checkerboard is, take a look at this, all a checkerboard is a 4-patch. That's it. So when you see this, you're like, oh, now let's say you're new. You're going to go, I just don't know how in the world. Look at here. The cameraman gave me the best idea. Look at this. Look how cute this is. See, I can just isolate all my little 4 patches as I walk across. This is nothing but 1, 2, 3, 4 times 1, 2, 3, 4. That's all this little quilt is. I made the decision to just make this simple, put a little frame around it. Now this could fold up and I could take this in my camper. When I start sewing, remember how I told you I just made all the little 2-patches? For this type of quilt, I will make every batch of 2-patches. So here we only have 2 colors, so this would be pretty simple. When I do that, I'm going to join them, those 2 pairs, into a set of 4. I will always go to the machine with this seam up. Every 4-patch I make will have that seam up in this kind of a project. I call this my north and south seam, and this my east and west seam. Here, this one's up, that one's down, but see how they reverse as you move across? So as long as every 4-patch is sewn identical, when you put these back together, they're going to always made up, because as you move into the next row, they will fix themselves. I do not press that east-west seam. I don't even frankly press the first batch. You can do what you want to, and if you feel like you need to press them, but if you leave this middle seam in where it's flexible, then you just know when you join this 4-patch to that 4-patch, whatever you do on that one, you do in that whole group. Now, if you look at this, you should be able to see that I ended up and took 4 patches, made set 1, set 2, set 3, set 4. I didn't run across in rows. You can, but this is an old Mary Ellen Hopkins technique, and any of you watching who was a Mary Ellen fan should hear her saying this in your sleep. If you work in clusters, you will always have a flatter quilt. The more you work in east-west rows of little squares running into little squares running into little squares, it starts to get wonky. If you can control it in clusters, what you end up with is a much flatter quilt. So that's a little checkerboard, and that will be one of the patterns. And I'm sure you're going, well, you need a pattern for that. Well, that's how I think, but that's not how the whole world thinks. So what we're going to give you in this batch of patterns that will be optional for you, if you don't feel like you need a pattern, then you don't need a pattern. These patterns are not going to be, now you cut 16 of these and 38 of those, and in some cases, it's just the overall, here's the block, make X number of blocks. So don't expect these to be 5-page layouts. They're going to be enough to get you going on this basic stuff. As it gets more complicated, then we'll add more direction for you. We did a program years ago, so some of you may have seen some of these quilts along the way. Here's what my favorite line is. Well, you've seen them again. What's fun about this? Let's again say you're brand new. You can just have a bunch of scraps. So if you cut yourself 18 6-inch squares, and they could be 6.5 or 7 or whatever, you can get both of these little quilts out of that exact same set of things, both quilts without borders, but it's working on the 4-patch thought. So let's take a look at this little quilt. Here's the 4-patch. I sewed it the same way I showed you. I put pairs together. Then when I sewed the 4-patch, as I go in the machine, I always have that top seam up. A lot of people would say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, I could do a 9-patch, couldn't I? But it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 this way. That tells me the 4-patch is my friend. 1, 2, 3 running east and west, 1, 2, 3, 4 running north and south. And then take a look at the back of that. See how much easier it is to control if you do. So if this one went up, down, up, this is going to be the opposite. And I'm betting there's somebody out there going, well, that makes no sense. Why wouldn't you just sew all these rows? Well, I'm telling you, folks, when you sew all those rows, it is inevitable that they're going to start getting wonky as you cross the end. You have so much more control over a flat quilt when you end up doing nothing but 4 patches. And on this particular pattern, what you have is 2 little projects. You have the squares, and now you have the bars. So from that same little square, after you cut those, you cut X number of rectangles. Now, when I sew the rectangles together, if you take a peek at the back of this, you'll see as I got my rows, this row went that way, this row went that way, and that row went that way. But then I had another little top, same thing, I kept them all going the same way. Because there's a bar in between these, it is not important that you do anything. It just makes it easier to sew it. So let's take a peek at this little fellow. It's X number of those just running in there. Now, again, I don't expect y'all going to want to enter this in a quilt show or anything, but I'm telling you, These are the quilts, especially with COVID and everything else been going on. This is the stuff you should be working on, because these are the things that keep you busy, let you practice your skills at your sewing machine, let you learn a little bit about direction, because truly, seam direction, I get more questions when I was teaching some hands-on from how do I control all those seams? You control it from the start. It's how you organize your first batch of work. Then it's consistency in how you repeat that work throughout that project in order to give you a flat quilt on the back. And I'm telling you, I get great joy out of finishing it, turning it over, and every seam is exactly where it's supposed to be. So that's what these little projects are for. Plus, if you've got little kids in your life and you want to make, like if it's little boys, you want to make them a little quilt for their little cars. Well, I guess that could be a little girl too, couldn't it? I love making these, and I have loads of scraps left over from my big quilts. So I have found that this is the style work that makes me a little happier. You know, your cameraman's real smart. So those of you who are new, you probably don't even know how smart your cameraman is, but he came up with, look, why don't I just do this little thing? And let me tell you, this is my favorite new little thing to do. Just take a square like in, and I lay this down. Now, you're like, well, that can't be 9 patches. Well, take a look here. Let me get that where you can see it. Oh dear, I need my bigger one. See, I made a bunch of them. See, look, there's my little 9 patch. Now, there's a 9 patch, but as you look at this in the corner, there's another 9 patch, but it's got 2 lights. If I'm going to marry this one to this one evenly, I still have to keep in mind my seam directions of what's a positive, what's a negative. Now that guy's kind of a confused one, because the more we want to change our design, the more we have to substitute, and it's not a pure positive negative like the last project that I've shown you. This is more learning to design another block. Now I could make a queen-size quilt by doing nothing but this pattern and joining those blocks together. I'll tell you another great little project for this is if you, depending on the size you cut your square, you could easily make this a placemat. You could also make this a dinner napkin. So if you made it smaller and you had a piece front, then you could put a solid back on it, layer that up, turn it, and you got a killer little dinner napkin. And if you got busy, you'd have those done for your St. Patty's Day event. So you just find yourself some little shamrock, or let's just say you like your brew, and you know on St. Patrick's Day sometimes there's brew involved. Then why you could just set your big oh gosh, what do they call that thing, Brian? That big, it's a growler. I love that. Whoever thought of calling a bottle of brew a growler? I'd like for somebody to explain that to me. Anyway, now this is really something for me that helps you learn that here's the 9 patch and here's the 9 patch, and then they each got rectangles added, and your pattern has this laid out for you exactly how you're going to do it. Do you need a pattern? Maybe not. So if you're real experienced, you could probably go, I'm just going to make my 9 patch and I'm going to lay that out and make my own quilt. Knock yourself out. That's what this is all about, doing what makes you happy. Now our next project is a little quilt called Neopolitan. And I have done this one, and the reason it's called Neopolitan, it's probably had another name somewhere in its life, but it's actually browns and creams and the pinkish red color. So that's like Neapolitan ice cream. So I thought that was a clever name. And this is where my 4 patch and my 9 patch learning gets me to doing a little more complicated. And this is a project that now grows a little, and it has 2 different. It has an A and a B block that you build with. So as you see laying on the table, here is my A and my B block. But I want to show you something. As I turn this over, look what it is. It is nothing but my original 9 patch. So I made my 9 patch, and whatever size this was, then I put kind of a center row on the sides of one block, and on the sides of the other block, it's a plain square. Then when I put other rectangles to it, I get this, and then when they go together, I get this. So that's how this entire quilt is built. We have given you the directions for the exact size of the one I use, but please bear in mind that all you have to do is change the size of that first cut and you've got a completely different quilt. So if you're just hot to get one done quick, make those squares a little bit larger, then you'll have to do the adjustment on your rectangle because it's 3 times whatever your square was. This is one that builds on the exact elements that were in Neopolitan. But what I love about this, as you take a look at this quilt, look at the empty space this allows you so that you can build. If you're a machine quilter or even a hand quilter, there's some killer space in there to work with. Let's say you don't want to quilt. Well, then that's where I'd put a busy fabric. So the color that you work with has everything to do with the outcome. But if you look at the center elements that live in this album block, it really is nothing but what we just made, but it's got a lot more components, a few more rectangles, the sizes change a little bit, and I would think this would be a fabulous large quilt. So you could continue building on this and make yourself a double, a queen, and even a king, again, depending on your fabric choices. Now, this is a little project that I did, oh my gosh, I bet I did this 10, 15 years ago. And it's really a takeoff. One of the things that's so great about squares is if you're a needle pointer, let's say you do some needle, I don't know if that was the right word, but if you do needlepoint, it's typically all the patterns for needlepoint are laid out as little squares. So here's your little square and it's a stitch. Well, that's how a lot of the pictorial quilts are built, where you're working on an image, then you use squares and you just alter the color of those squares. So this really came, I didn't invent this or anything. This came off of a needlepoint grid. I just executed it in Patchwork. Everything in this quilt that you're looking at is done with nothing but 9 patches. So this is a little wonkier because this just tells you folks, if I showed you some of my beginning work, you'd see how much I have learned. But if I look here, see how there's a 9 patch that's made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lights, and only one of the things that creates the flower. And then that changes and that changes. They're all 9 patches, but you really have to bear in mind, you have to call one a positive and one a negative when you assemble this. So what I recommend, if you don't have a design wall, I recommend you get a sheet or something. A really good thing is to buy a real cheap vinyl tablecloth because the back is a flannel that these little squares will lay into. And you can lay this out and then you will sew it later, or you can build it in rows, but sew it in clusters. The border is the same thing. The border is nothing but a cluster of 9 patches. That's all this whole thing is. I remade one. Your pattern is for the first one that I showed you. That's what your pattern is. If you've done any of the work where you do squares and you create wreaths and things with them, you know that the way you change the color, like you go to a all cream or a partial green and a partial pink, you can change this outside line. I did some changing on this, and I'm not giving you the pattern for this because I want you to play with this. As I laid this out, I decided to make a little more definition in this rose because typically you would not have a rose that was one perfect square. So I played around with color on this one. My little branch, I got a little creative. I don't know that a rose bush ever grows that way, but I made it that way. So I could have changed it and put the brown all the way down here. This is where you start designing on your own. I would use a variety of fabrics here, or maybe you have a large floral that's got a multiple amount of pinks and reds in it. You might be able to get away with one large fabric here, same thing in your green. But this starts to get a little more complicated, and I do love these squares being no larger than 1 inch finished, maybe even at 3/4. So like cut 1 1/4 or that. This is built on a 1 inch grid, so they're all cut 1 1/2, but this is arbitrary. Now that little segment completes the 7 patterns that we are offering you in a cluster buy. Now, I'm sure some of you are going, where in the world am I going to find these? Anything that we're showing you is going to be in the video description below, so all of you that are familiar with this know where to hunt all that stuff. I never know. I have to have the cameraman help me find it most of the time. You're like, how much are those patterns, Kaye? And what am I buying and how am I going to get them? Okay, folks, we've talked about this. It's such a cheap price that we can't even talk about it, because the BBC, the FCC, the ABCs, and all those people said you can't talk about this stuff online. It's that kind of price. Everything is a PDF. You can download this for a silly, unreasonable. We don't even know why we do stuff like this. We ought to just pay you to take it. That's about where we are, folks. But let's take a look at some options for you. This is a Carrie Nation quilt, which builds on all of this little tiny work. It's nothing but little squares and big squares. Mary Todd Lincoln, which follows that. This is another killer 9-patch quilt. And then look at this Burgoyne Surrounded. This particular quilt is very much like where we built the Rose Garden or we built the album quilt. It just continues to build with squares and rectangles. And take a look at this bordered 9-patch. Now, I was on the fence about making this part of a later series, but because it builds on a center 9-patch and has elements built around it, sort of in a log cabin fashion, I thought it would make sense. Country Lanes is perhaps one of my favorite older patterns. And I'm telling you, it just loves. The more scrap you have in it, the happier this quilt is. Let's look at a few of my antique quilts that we're going to just flash some photographs for you now. There are no patterns. These are quilts in my collection, and you can just look at them for inspiration. Now, this first quilt we're looking at is a postage stamp quilt, which is really the late 1800s quilt. And for those of you who collect a lot of squares, look how fabulous. This one lives pretty much forever in my sewing room on the wall. It is one of my favorite in my collection. The next quilt that we're going to look at is this little 9-patch. And again, it's that same thing where we made one single 9-patch. It's just how big you want it. But all of these quilts are, for the most part, late 19th century one just called patches, which is nothing but plain squares, but she's a beauty. Then this 1860 squares only quilt. Then we have a bars and squares quilt, 1850. And a couple of 9-patch quilts, both from about the 1860s and 1870s. One's just 9-patch, and one is a 9-patch alternate. You have a free stuff icon that lives on the Kaye England page where you go buy patterns and books and things. And because I want you to be able to have those for inspiration if you want to and you want to download those photos, there's no patterns involved in those, but they may be ones you want to add to your library. Here I am with my trusty pointer. It's a large needle. I don't know what machine this would fit, but it might be good if you had to prod somebody to get something done. It might work for that. Okay, let's look. I redid Country Lanes in the 1930s with this, and you'll see this photo as well with it, but I did forget to mention it, and I wanted you to see that. The little quilt that's on the table right here is Neopolitan, and you'll see that in full bloom. We just used these, frankly, to hide some other stuff that I was too lazy to move. And this is just a 4-patch and a plain square. A 4-patch plain square. So it's really a 4-patch made up of 4 squares made it to 1 square. These are some of the favorite quilts that I own just simply because I love the combination of patterns used and again, the fact that these are mostly well over 100-year-old fabrics. I get a great kick out of these. They're fragile. I'm pretty careful about how I use them, and they just make me happy. This is a very early quilt with a lot of rectangles. I'm telling you, this is a woman who just couldn't figure out what she wanted to sew, and/or she had a boatload of things and she just needed to get them used up. This has got the most wonderful collection of old fabrics in it. It again is fragile. I love these quilts, and I think we make a mistake in believing every quilt you turn out has got to be something that can go into a quilt show. Sometimes you just need to sew because you just need to sew. These are the quilts that I enjoy, quite frankly, about as much as anything that's complicated. This is one I would have loved to have met this woman, because she took 3 patches. I'm assuming it was a she, maybe it was a he, and then she mated them to 5 patches. Now, folks, 3 doesn't divide into 5, so she had to do some conordering, and that's a fancy word, in order to get these to match. But this is such a sweet little quilt. And again, remember, I bought it, so it's not like I got these for nothing. I love the way that she created it, and the thing that you should bear in mind is most of the time they didn't sew the same way we sewed. This was likely intended to keep somebody warm, not be in a show or anything like that. Now here's one that, again, this is a woman that I'd like to have hung out with, because take a look at this. It's kind of rectangles and kind of squares and kind of other stuff and kind of other stuff and then a little bit of other stuff. Ultimately, she did create it, and it is in a blocked fashion. This is a top only. I'm not probably ever going to finish it, but it lives out on display most of the time, folded up on a shelf. It's just a sweet quilt. That's all I can say about it. And I'm sure she was a blast to hang around. If you own a good collection of fabrics that fits your decor and you're dying to do something with them, folks, just stick them in a big old quilt like this, and you can decide to make it a 4-patch, or you can decide to make it a 9-patch. Build your pattern out first and then make the quantity that lets you assemble it, because remember, the way you sew it is going to determine whether it's flat and clean. What I love about this is it's a big 9-patch with a big square that matches the 9-patch, and in some cases she's pieced this big square onto other elements. And look at this, even in the center of this 9-patch, unlike that one, she made a baby 9-patch. Now this last quilt that's on top is the Country Lanes quilt, which you just saw as one of our available patterns, and it is only available as a PDF. This is another little interesting quilt, and this is just in my collection. There's no pattern for it, but take a look at it. It's a 4-patch with sidebars and a row across the top. So this rectangle is the size of those 2 squares, as is that one. And then so it's a 1, 2, 3, 4-patch ultimately built like that, and whatever size that is what that is. We have loved being back with you folks. We hope that you enjoy this. We'd love to see your post. I don't care if y'all whip out a 4-patch and you post it tomorrow. I'd love to see what you're doing. I'd love to get an idea of how you're working, and be sure and tell us if there's something that we didn't cover that you go, why in the world didn't you say how we could do this? We're going to be adding to this. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day. Stay safe, and we'll see you next video. Bye-bye.